Greetings, everyone, and welcome to TRG 30, the last edition of TRG 30 in 2021. TRG 30, where we are talking about bold change for our sector's resilience. And this day, I come to you from Denver, where I have been with our senior leadership team for the first time in person. It's a delightful experience. And it's going to be an equally delightful experience for me to introduce my guest today to talk about this subject, the next generation of arts philanthropy and arts funding. Today, I'm going to be joined by Melissa Cowley Wolf, who is the founder of MCW Projects and the director of Arts Funders Forum. Melissa, I'll love for you to come on screen and join me, and also by Zannie Voss, who is the director of SMU Data Arts and a guest on many occasions with us at TRG, and last year at this time at TRG 30. Zannie, welcome to you, both of you. I want to start our conversation today with a little bit of grounding, and I'm going to ask both of you from your catbird seats and vantage points to do the same. And then, as you know, we'll break into dialogue and perhaps take some questions. I would encourage all of you who have them to put them in the Q&A area of our room today so that we can entertain them and integrate them into our conversation. Let me start here with a reminder that at the beginning of the pandemic, our partners and now a member of our family, Purple 7, we started the COVID-19 sector benchmark. And this was a program, still is a program, that ingests hundreds of organizations' data so that we can look at arts consumption data in the context of the pandemic, as well as previous and as we keep going. And with that information in mind, we cracked open for this conversation a look at philanthropy and trends in philanthropy that I want to share with you as a grounding point for our conversation today. So first, let's look at North American philanthropy. This chart that has a lot of things on it really is quite simple. If you look at the bottom, we're looking at 2019 to 2021. And what I've highlighted in green is November to November of 19 to 2021. This is North American blue bars gifts and purple bar revenue from arts, from individual philanthropy to the arts and cultural organizations, excuse me, that number now more than 500 in the COVID sector benchmark. Here's my takeaway and what I'm hearing from our clients as well. While during the pandemic, we saw arts philanthropy kick into high gear, in the past handful of months, 6, especially since we've reopened and we've begun to, consumers have begun spending money on tickets and the experiences, the philanthropic income has been on a decline. Is that the case in your organization? Is your team galvanizing the advocates and the brand new buyers that were so responsible in North America for the revenue that came in philanthropically? Is your team working hard to ensure that those relationships are continuing with you into 2022? In the UK, the story is slightly different. Same orientation, 19 to 21, looking November to November. We saw that in the databases of UK organizations, consumers were engaged not just in the activities of exchange, but also in the investment in arts and culture in the UK. So the volume of philanthropic giving actually has been growing, but the revenues have been relatively flat. In this region of the global arts and cultural sector, the question that we are asking is, how will we, especially as we think about the future of funding for arts and culture in the UK, in Canada, governmentally, how can we take these relationships that have been activated during the pandemic and carry them with us in new ways as we move forward into 22 and beyond? Prior to the pandemic, one more thing I would bring into our conversation that Zannie and Melissa are going to be talking about further. Prior to the pandemic, pardon me, at TRG, we were bringing forward these realities about demographic changes in the US, in Canada, and the UK, related to diversity and related to age and transition of generations. So these realities are in us, they are on us. And Zannie, as you look at the data at Data Arts and think about the question of the next generation of philanthropy, I'm curious what's caught your attention. But first, would you just tell us a little bit about SMU Data Arts and what your team is up to there?
Thanks, Jill. Happy to. Hello, everyone. I'm Zannie Voss, Director of SMU Data Arts, which is a National Center for Arts Research. We are building a national culture of data-driven decision-making for those who want to see the arts and culture sector thrive. And we do that through the collection and the integration of data in an effort to model the national arts and culture ecosystem, and through research out of the data that generates useful insights. So our work is possible because of a network of partners around the country, like our dear partners at TRG. And so I'm going to take us back to trends that were occurring heading into the start of the pandemic, so 2020. And I want to share 3 top-line trends with you. First, the post-recession march of growth in total expenses came to a halt in 2020, shedding 11% of total budget size in that 1 year alone. And the drop was severe enough to result in the average organization's budget being 4% lower in 2020 than it was in 2017, taking into account inflation. So we had been under this growth is good mantra for years and years and years, and 2020 kind of set that on its heels. So the average organization actually became smaller. Second, 2020 reversed a downward trend in the average arts organization support from major sources. And organizations of color actually saw some highlights, some bright spots. So in 2020, overall, we saw that 2-year pre-pandemic declines in the level of expenses that are covered by support from trustees, other individuals, and foundations upticked and returned to 2017 levels in 2020. So this is comparing the percentage or the relative amount of expenses that each source supports. If we were to look at the dollars alone, we'd see that like expenses, growth and support from individuals, both trustees and other individuals, from foundations and from corporations also trailed inflation. And so even though we're a little bit higher in terms of absolute terms, their growth did not keep pace with inflation, despite the boost in 2020. It was only government funding that rose every year and outpaced inflation for the 4-year period. All levels of government support actually were at their 5-year peak in 2020 after annual increases. This doesn't even reflect the 2021 shuttered venue operator grants that are going to start coming onto the horizon. The subset of organizations that primarily serve Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Arab, and Asian American communities experienced much more positive trends. For them, foundation, government, and corporate support covered more expenses over time, and growth in these areas far exceeded inflation. And third point, it became harder for organizations to raise each dollar of revenue. Overall, it took 3% more in fundraising expenses to raise $1 of contributed revenue over time, accounting for inflation. So it went from $7.69 to $8.51. A dollar could raise $7.69, $1 could raise $8.51. Perhaps we'll see that a big blip in 2021 with more of the big government relief funds showing up in the data, but for now, that's what we're seeing. But for organizations that primarily serve communities of color, it actually took 1% less. So kind of overall, we're seeing budget declines in total, constrictions of budgets. We're seeing pulling back in terms of support from major sources, bringing them back to 2017 levels. And yet for organizations of color, we're actually seeing a much more positive outlook. Mm-hmm. And with that, Jill, I'm going to turn it back.
Yeah. So as we all in this collective room listen to this data, no matter the region, these trends that you're hearing from me and from Zannie and Melissa, we're going to move to you now. I know, we know, can be extrapolated to your city, your region, your country, as you consider what Melissa, now you might share from the Arts Funders Forum perspective.
Sure. Thank you, Jill, and the TRG team. And such a pleasure to be in conversation with you two ladies who I refer to as powerhouses. Really grateful to be here with you. As Jill mentioned, I am the director of a consultancy called MCW Projects and the founder of that, and also the director of the Arts Funders Forum. And our focus is really on how do we increase the next gen involvement in cultural philanthropy. So I work with cultural organizations on philanthropic strategies and also with family offices and next gen philanthropists on creating impact and legacy in the cultural sector. And then the Arts Funders Forum is a platform of 6,000 community members and growing that's focused on developing new models for impact-driven financial support of the cultural sector. Prior to 2020, we were already seeing a lot of the trends that have been accelerated by COVID and the growing social justice movement over the last 2 years. These were the trends that my colleagues at the Arts Funders Forum and I were noticing, and what encouraged us to create a platform that would address them head on and specifically speak with next gen donors about how they can create social impact through their arts funding, talking to those that are not already involved in the arts that need to be in order for our sector to survive and thrive. So to put a little bit in context, we are in the middle of the largest intergenerational wealth transfer in human history. That number that says 30 trillion is now estimated to be upwards of $70 trillion will be transferred from one generation to another over the next few decades. While this is underway, we've been seeing that giving to the arts has been decreasing. Arts giving consistently represents only 4% of overall charitable giving within the entire charitable giving sector. It has not been increasing, and previous information that Jill outlined can show to how we're having a reverse in those trends. And we also know that those who are inheriting this massive transfer of wealth do not consider the arts as essential. They have been increasingly turning their time, their time and their money to areas of education, social, racial, and climate justice. And so looking at this, we all know that the last 2 years have really accelerated that trend. And I was really curious, as many of us were, for the Giving USA report to drop about 6 months ago, which is the longest running and most comprehensive study of charitable giving in the United States. And what we saw during this pandemic year was that 2020 charitable giving broke records in the United States. Over $471 billion was donated, which is an increase of over 5% from 2019. And when you break it down, it's $1.29 billion a day. Giving by individuals, foundations, and bequests all increased from 2019. And Giving USA looks at the charitable, splits us up into 9 charitable sectors. 7 of those 9 saw growth. Arts and culture was one of the 2 that did not see growth. Arts, culture, and humanities sector is estimated to have declined over 7% to 19.47 billion. And when we adjust that for inflation, the decline is over 8%. And while $19 billion may sound like a lot, when you recognize that our industry is an over $800 billion industry that represents 4% of America's GDP, but remains stagnant, as I mentioned, at 4% of overall American giving, we're not making big headway. The giving doesn't reflect our output as economic drivers within cities across the United States and across the world. And as we know, arts and culture represents a greater portion of the economy than transportation, tourism, and agriculture. So 19 billion in that context is not very much. I like showing this slide just briefly because it gives you a really quick visual glance at those 9 sectors. And you see there we are towards second from the bottom, arts and culture jutting out into that negative percentage. So this gives us a lot of worry and cause for reflection as to why. And what we do know from our research within the Arts Funders Forum and other sources is that next gen donors are increasingly not seeing the link between giving to the arts and driving social impact in their communities and in the world at large. And so there is a reflection of that in those 2020 numbers. the lack of connection between what we're doing as a sector and what they're seeing as essential to driving global progress. And I will leave it there and open that up for conversation.
Well, so such powerful data as we consider what has been happening in the United States and in the UK, North America and the UK. And then as we, Zannie, think about, the aggregated data that you've reflected that goes beyond individual philanthropy, both you and Melissa. And really what I hear in your words and in your data and insight is a call for change. And so I'm curious, actually, what would both of you say would be what's the risk of not changing? What needs to change? What's at risk if we don't change, from your point of view? Zannie, would you go first and just?
Sure. Gosh, and when I think about what is at risk if you don't change, it's on a couple of points. First, I've heard in speaking with some organizations, particularly large performing arts organizations from traditionally Eurocentric disciplines, who are like, I believe in this DEI thing, but we just need to make money. We need to earn money right now. And I think that organizations that put a sense of equity and changing, the tension between the growth is good mantra, is it all about getting back to a high level of expenses? Or is it about changing your practices so you become a more inclusive place, even if that may mean changing some of your pricing decisions, changing some of your programmatic decisions, taking more risks in that area? The risk is that we're never going back to pre-pandemic times. There has been a racial justice movement. There is a radical prioritization within society that I think has to be recognized. And organizations that don't prioritize being relevant to the vast spectrum of people within their communities risk becoming important to a smaller and smaller slice of their communities, losing relevance. And what we've seen in some of the research we did with the Wallace Foundation, talking with 40-something organizational leaders, you don't get to financial resilience without relevance. Community relevance, building community, is the thing you need to get really right if you're going to retain long-term stability. And so it's a question of what are you doing now? The risk is, how are you using this moment in time to build your sense of relevance with the people who live by it?
Melissa, as you listen to Zannie,
I have a frozen Jill on my screen at the moment. We'll give it a second. It's that Denver Wi-Fi. I think she was going to ask me, I'll just keep this going. As I listen to Zannie, how do I react to that? And I couldn't agree more. I think the risk of not changing is irrelevancy and extinction of the sector. I think it's that vital. We are at a massive turning point in every area of modern 21st century society. And I think Zannie really hit it. What is relevancy? Relevancy is community building, and it's driving social impact. And that is what we know that the donors who are going to be stepping into their philanthropic maturity and driving philanthropy for the next several generations want to see. And so it's incumbent on organizations to look at the work that they do and prioritize the work that really builds community and drives social impact. And in a lot of cases, this doesn't mean scrapping your mission and throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It means looking at what you're doing and prioritizing in a slightly different way. It also means building more authentic relationships. And it means listening to those next generation donors who are very, very vocal in their desires for how they want to support organizations. We know they're less transactional than previous generations. They care more about how they give, not just what they give. They don't want their name they don't care about their name being on the wall. They want to roll up their sleeves and get involved in shaping core programming. So I did see a question here of giving circles and young donor boards. And it's something that, has really been on everyone's minds over the last decade plus, but really in the last year is how do we engage these donors? And, it's not just It's not just doing things and for show. It's really integrating them into the core programming, to listening to what they want. They want to bring their expertise, their professional and personal expertise to the table. So it's a different type of relationship. It's a different type of philanthropy. It's a different type of advancement, and it requires listening and then shaping your priorities around what your community wants to hear.
I'm back, and excuse the interruption there, but as I was with a group of CEOs that I convene with on a pretty regular basis, and this conversation about board and governance in the context of this conversation, the conversation we were having was about equity, diversity, inclusion, and access. But that is solidly in the center of what's changing in philanthropy, what's changing in the markets of the organizations we're talking about. And I'm curious what you, Zannie, what your own insights are about the role of governance in driving this kind of change.
You know, I think where we see resistance in organizations frequently is at the board level. It's not at the executive leader level. And I think that executive leaders recognize the need for change, but if the board is not supportive of that change, then the change doesn't get the traction that it needs. And it's difficult because of the tension that trustee giving, that your board members are also major donors. Organizations bring in an average of 40% of total individual contributions from this core group of core supporters. So how do you change their hearts and minds so that you're able to do the work that you know is necessary? How do you help them to get up to speed in understanding how not just meeting their needs as board members, but really the organization having to make some difficult changes to meet the needs of its community? How does that come into play?
Yeah, you see the chats that are coming through here about board and listening to funders versus, and how funders inform priorities. The polarity of managing that, Melissa, is an interesting. I'm curious about your reflection on what is how do you set priorities when you put funders in the middle of that conversation? How do you strike that right balance to engage them and to also drive the organization strategically soundly?
It's a great question. And I think to Zannie's point and the questions that are coming in about our loyal traditional board members, I mean, in many cases, these are the board members that built the institution. These are the board members that got the area zoned, got the architect, fought with the city, worked with the city, got these institutions built these collections, and really changed the landscape of our cities and towns across the country and across the world. And so, the work that they've done is crucial, and we applaud them for that. And it's by no means this doesn't matter anymore. I think the job of the organization, as you said, the executives know where we have to go. Because they're on the ground with the public, I think a lot more frequently, not everyone, but there's, a sense within these organizations who are listening to conversations like this of where we need to go. I think you need to be nimble and nuanced as an organization to realize you're working with multiple generations at a point of turnover. And that is, you can be the mediator there. It's not easy, but that's the point that we're at. And as far as listening to the funder, obviously you're not going to change your entire priority and mission of your organization in response to what funders want. But what these next gen donors are telling us is not just how they want to give, but really how the world is changing, and they're going to be the drivers of that world. And so how can our organizations move into that 21st century model, which Jill, you speak about a lot? And it is a pivotal time to do that with that community involvement and to be a place where that conversation can happen. And these institutions can be reflective of diverse audiences. There definitely is a difference between, sort of how conversations we have about DEI and actually how that is just a part of how younger generations view and see the world and innate in their worldview. And I think this all needs to be integrated. I think that, when one of the best ways to speak with current boards that I've seen in more traditional boards is a lot of the data that has just been presented today doesn't necessarily make it into those boardrooms in a way that is a priority. I've found that from my presentations to different nonprofit boards, it's for a lot of them, it's the first time they're hearing this information. They are specialists in what they do in their particular fields, but they're not following every day of arts funding and philanthropy the way that we are. So I see such a change with board members when this information is put in front of them and they see it clearly in those numbers, and it helps start to make that change of, okay, we obviously need to do something differently if we care about this institution and want to advance it forward, especially once their time is done and they've passed the baton.
So yeah, please, Zannie, please.
I was going to say there are a couple of questions that have come in that are kind of resonating with the points. Someone asked about millennials. How do you engage them, and how do we think about them? But relatedly, there's a question of how can individual organizations prove value and worth to donors when their work has little social impact, concentrating instead on excellence or on quality, which are for-profit values. So what are some of the ways that organizations can tap into? Because it really is, this is where the zeitgeist is going with respect to many of the foundations. It's away from, it's towards social justice. And I think that's an increasing priority in organizations that don't see themselves fitting in with social justice. I think are going to have a really hard time getting to financial stability and retaining the support that they historically benefited from.
Yeah,
so
and
I throw that out.
Yeah, yes, and that's not just an issue in the US. I just read the 10-year plan from Arts Council England, who, one of the core tenets of it is about measuring the impact or measuring the diversity of staffs and audiences and holding the sector to the changes or account to the changes that are coming there too. I know the same is true in Canada. You both used the word listening at various times in your insights and your sharing. And I think the thing that I would love for you to wrap up with is, what should we be listening to? We should be listening to the data. How do we listen, and whom do we listen to? What do we listen to as we look to 22 and beyond? Zannie, would you start?
Sure. I would ask every organization to say, whose needs are we meeting? Are we meeting our needs and the things we want to do, or are we really meeting the needs of the community? And the only way you can understand what community needs are is to get out and to talk to people, to listen, to be a mutually supportive partner with other members of your community and organizations that support community priorities. The old adage of to have a friend, you have to be a friend. And I think that as organizations, that's increasingly important. I have another one with respect to expenses, but I'm going to save that for the moment.
Melissa?
I second that. I mean, I think you need to be listening. You need to be listening to your audiences. You need to be engaged in conversation with them. You need to be surveying them. You need to be communicating with them over social media. I mean, you hop on social media now, no one holds back. It is when a show opens at an institution, when an opera premieres, when there's a leadership change at an organization, when something is discovered about a board member, the communities and audiences respond. People are very clear on their thoughts and feelings. And I think there's a lot to be gleaned from that. I know there can be a lot of chatter, yes, but there's something to be gleaned there. And I think continuing to engage in dialogue, hosting conversations with your audiences and your supporters. We are all so strapped for time, and this is an entirely new kind of way of interfacing with the audience, but it is super essential to get that feedback and to also have that, as Zannie said, drive your programming. Listen and respond to what you're seeing your audience want. Arts organizations are lucky in that they are already doing work that is rooted in responding to contemporary society. That's what artists are doing. They are reflecting on our moment. They are comparing our moment to historical moments. They are showing us who we are, and they are showing us our humanity. So there's a lot that can be pulled from that, and as a departure point of discussion. And we are, I think, really well situated to be these town halls for discussion and use our programming as a launch point for those discussion, and then start to build a pathway forward in terms of our core programming and our cultivation of our audiences and sponsors from that dialogue.
Yeah, so I would wrap us up by saying also we need to listen to the data, right? So wherever we are, whatever place we operate from, listening to our constituents, our communities, and the data to ensure that we're hearing and behaving in ways that manage expenses, that situate us for growth or for stability in the right ways. Listen, you two, we could talk for another 30 minutes. It is the bottom of the hour. I couldn't be more grateful to both of you for joining us today. And the volume of thoughts and questions that have come in, listen, it's terrific. And if there are unanswered questions here, you all, we will get them answered. My colleagues, Caitlin and Stephen, will help us ensure we do that. Thank you always for joining us at TRG 30, and know that we're coming back at the top of the year with another episode as we head into 2022. But now I would say to everyone here, have wonderful December holidays. Hopefully it will be restorative and help with your resilience into the next year as it comes. Thank you, both of you, and we'll see you again after the new year. Thanks, everyone.
What an honor. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.